The old man stood at the edge of the trench with his boots sinking into fresh mud, staring down at a coil of split black pipe like it was the body of an old friend. Water was still leaking out of the broken line in a slow, defeated trickle. Soaking into the dirt, instead of running where it was supposed to run, down through 11 acres of pasture, into 3 troughs into the lungs of 40 head of cattle, who didn't know yet that their whole world had just been cut off at the root. Walter Briggs was 71 years old, and in 52 of those years, he had never once had to explain to a judge that water belonged to him. He was about to learn that explaining it wasn't the hard part. Making a rich man in a $200 polo shirt believe it, that was the hard part. 3 days earlier, a backhoe had rolled onto the property next door driven by a crew that worked for a man named Preston Colby Vance. And by the time the machine shut off for the night, 80 feet of decorative limestone retaining wall sat curring in the sun directly on top of the buried service line that had carried water to Walter's herd since before Vance had ever set foot in the county. Walter didn't yell. He didn't call anybody a fool, though the word crossed his mind more than once. He walked back to the house, poured a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and sat down at the kitchen table with a manila folder he hadn't opened in almost 15 years. Inside that folder was the reason this story was about to become the most expensive mistake of Preston Vance's life. But to understand how a stone wall turned into an $80,000 lawsuit, you have to go back to the beginning, back before the wall, before the backhoe. Before a man named Vance ever looked at 140 acres of quiet Nebraska pastureland and decided it was his to reshape however he pleased. Walter Briggs bought his land in 1974, back when a young man with a steady job at the grain elevator could scrape together a down payment on 80 acres if he didn't mind eating beans 4 nights a week for the better part of a decade. He built his own barn, board by board, on weekends when his back could take it. He married a schoolteacher named Doris who taught him more about patience than any drought ever had, and together they raised 2 sons on that land. Buried one old dog after another beneath the cottonwood by the creek, and turned 80 acres into 140 through 2 careful purchases when neighboring parcels came up for sale. Doris passed in 2019. Walter kept the ranch running because it was the only version of grief he knew how to survive. The land wasn't glamorous. It was honest, flat, windswept, threaded through with shelter belts his father-in-law had planted in the 50s. But it had one asset that mattered more than anything else out there: water. In 1988, Walter had paid to run a private supply line from his well down across the low corner of the neighboring parcel, connecting to a secondary feed that kept his herd watered through even the meanest August. That corner belonged at the time to a rancher named Otto Kessler, and Otto, being the kind of man who understood that neighbors survive by helping each other, not squeezing each other, had signed off on a recorded utility easement without so much as raising an eyebrow. The county recorder's office had it on file. The surveyor had staked it. It was written into both deeds, plain as the fence line itself, granting Walter permanent right of access to inspect, maintain, and repair that line whenever the need arose. For 36 years, nobody thought twice about it. Walter walked the corridor twice a year, cleared brush, checked for erosion, and went back to his chores. Otto Kessler passed away in 2021, and his children, none of whom wanted to ranch, sold the parcel to a real estate holding company that, for 2 years, did nothing but let the grass grow tall and the fence posts lean. Then, on a windy Tuesday in April, a caravan of black trucks rolled down the county road, and everything changed. Preston Colby Vance did not introduce himself so much as he announced himself. He arrived in a truck so clean it looked like it had never touched gravel. Wearing sunglasses that cost more than Walter's first tractor, and within a week the whole township knew his plan: turn the old Kessler parcel into what his glossy real estate flyer called Meadowbrook Reserve, a legacy estate for the discerning few. Vance had made his money flipping luxury short-term rentals in Colorado, and he talked about curated rural living the way other men talked about weather. He wanted a grand entrance, a stacked limestone wall framing a circular drive, imported ornamental grasses, and according to the drone footage he posted online almost weekly, a reimagined agrarian aesthetic that would make his 14 acres look like something out of a lifestyle magazine. The first time Walter met him face to face, he was out walking the easement corridor with a bundle of orange marking flags, same as he did every spring before the ground softened. He heard the truck before he saw it, tires crackling over gravel with a kind of self-important urgency, and when he turned around, Vance was leaning out the window with his sunglasses pushed up into his hair. "Can I help you with something?" Vance asked, in the tone of a man who already suspected the answer was no, he could not. Walter explained plainly that a water line ran under that corner of the property, that it had been there since 1988, and that the flags were just markers so nobody dug into it by accident. Vance's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Nobody told me about a pipe," he said. "My title company would have caught something like that." "It's recorded," Walter said. "County office has it. I've got a copy at the house if you want to see it." "I'm sure it's fine," Vance said, in the voice of a man closing a conversation rather than continuing one. Just try not to leave flags all over my frontage. It throws off the sightlines for the entrance. Walter pulled the flags that afternoon, not because he agreed with the man, but because 36 years of neighborly patience doesn't disappear over one prickly conversation. He figured once Vance's own surveyor walked the property and found the recorded easement sitting right there in black and white, the man would come around. He figured wrong. For 6 weeks, construction noise rolled across the fence line, graders, dump trucks, a small army of landscapers hauling in truckloads of limestone block. Walter kept to his own business, mending fence, moving cattle between pastures, hauling feed as the spring grass came in. He assumed, the way a reasonable man assumes reasonable things, that somewhere in that 6 weeks somebody on Vance's crew would run the plans past the county, see the recorded easement on the plat map, and route the entrance around it. Nobody did. On the second Thursday of June, Walter's hired hand, a quiet 26-year-old named Dale Osgood, radioed in from the south pasture to say the water pressure in the far trough had dropped to almost nothing. Walter drove out, checked the pump house, checked the filters, checked every valve he could reach on his own land. Everything read normal. But the pressure kept falling, slow and steady, like something on the other side of the fence was choking the line one turn at a time. He walked the corridor toward the property line, and before he'd gone 20 yards he smelled wet mortar and fresh-cut stone dust hanging in the June air. Then he saw it. A curved limestone wall, roughly 80 feet long and 3 feet high, ran directly along the low corner of the Vance property, the exact stretch of ground where Walter's service line had been buried 36 years earlier. Stacked block, poured footings. A wrought iron gate arch going up at the center, half-finished, gleaming black in the afternoon sun. It sat there like a monument to a man who had never once bothered to ask a single question that mattered. Walter stood with his hands on his hips for a long moment, feeling the particular kind of anger that doesn't shout. It just goes quiet and starts counting. He called Vance that evening. Vance picked up on the third ring, breezy, like a man who had no idea his name was about to end up on a court docket. "Preston," Walter said, "your wall's sitting on top of my water line." "My crew flagged some old markings," Vance said. "They built around it." "You didn't build around it," Walter said. "You buried it under 3 feet of stacked stone and a concrete footing. My trough pressure's already failing." There was a pause, and then Vance's voice sharpened just slightly, the polish cracking around the edges. "Walter, I'm not tearing out a $40,000 entrance feature over some pipe from the 80s. It's not from the 80s, Walter said. It's active, it's recorded, it's legally binding today. Maybe on paper, Vance said. Walter let that sentence sit in his ear for a second, turning it over. Maybe on paper. As if paper wasn't the entire difference between a right and a trespass. As if 36 years of recorded law could be waved off with a shrug and a nice-looking retaining wall. "You need to get this fixed," Walter said, "before it gets worse." "Or what?" Vance said, and there it was, the friendliness gone just like that, replaced by something flatter and colder. "Or I'll make you fix it," Walter said. Vance laughed, short and dismissive. "Good luck with that, old-timer." And he hung up. That night, after Dale had gone home and the cattle had finally settled by the south trough, Walter sat alone at the kitchen table with the manila folder in front of him. He hadn't touched it since the year Doris had helped him organize the filing cabinet, color-coding tabs in her neat schoolteacher handwriting. Inside was the original 1988 easement agreement, signed by Otto Kessler, notarized, recorded with the county. A surveyor's plat showing the corridor. A legal description spelling out, in dense but unmistakable language, Walter's permanent right of access to inspect, maintain, and repair the line running beneath that corner of ground, regardless of who owned it. He ran his thumb along the edge of the old paper and felt something in his chest settle, quiet and certain. Vance had money. Vance had a crew and a drone and a glossy brochure. But Walter had 36 years of the truth, filed, stamped, and sitting in a drawer, waiting for someone to take it seriously. The next morning he drove into town and called a lawyer. Her name was Renata Cho, and she ran a 2-room office above the hardware store, the kind of practice built on 3 decades of boundary disputes, water rights fights, and the occasional inheritance war between siblings who hadn't spoken in years. She didn't have a fountain pen or a wall of diplomas. She had a coffee mug that said World's OKAYST Lawyer and a filing system that looked chaotic until you watched her find exactly what she needed in 4 seconds flat. Walter laid the folder on her desk and told her everything, the flags, the conversation in April, the wall, the phone call. Renata read the easement twice, tapped it once with a highlighter, and looked up at him with an expression that told him this was not going to be a quick, friendly resolution. "This isn't ambiguous," she said. "This isn't a fences 2 feet off kind of dispute. You have a recorded utility easement with full maintenance rights, and he's built a permanent structure directly on top of it. That's obstruction, plain and simple." "What's that mean for me?" Walter asked. "It means your new neighbor just built himself a very expensive mistake," Renata said. Then her face turned serious. "But the first priority isn't the wall, it's the water. If that line's compromised under all that weight, every day you wait makes the damage worse. I'm filing for emergency relief this week." She did exactly that. And while the paperwork moved through the system, life on the ranch got harder in small, grinding ways. The kind of trouble that doesn't explode all at once, but wears a person down one cracked morning at a time. Walter and Dale hauled water in an old tank trailer that rattled like it was held together by stubbornness alone. A neighbor who boarded 2 horses on Walter's back pasture called, near tears, to say she might have to move them if the water situation didn't improve. Walter told her he understood. He did. But after he hung up, he sat in the tack room for a long while, just staring at the dust on the floor, feeling tired in a way sleep wasn't going to fix. What Vance had done wasn't just careless. It reached into the one thing that kept the whole operation alive and squeezed. A few days before the hearing, Walter ran into Vance near the property line, standing beside a landscape designer, pointing at the half-built gate arch like a man admiring his own kingdom. Walter should have kept walking. He knew that even as he crossed the grass toward them. "Come to admire the entrance," Vance said, flashing that same polished grin. "Came to remind you the wall's still sitting on my easement," Walter said. Vance glanced at his designer, amused, like Walter was part of the local scenery. "You're really committed to this pipe thing." "It's not a pipe thing," Walter said. "It's a legal access thing." Vance stepped closer, lowering his voice into something that was meant to sound private but landed as condescending instead. "You know what your problem is? You've been out here so long you think history gives you ownership over everybody else's future." Walter almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the nerve of it was almost impressive. Here was a man who'd owned the land for a few months, lecturing him about ownership. "History's not the issue, Preston," Walter said. "The deed is." Vance's smile thinned. "We'll see what a judge thinks." They did. The emergency hearing took place on a gray Thursday morning in a county courtroom small enough that every footstep echoed. Vance arrived in a charcoal suit, flanked by an attorney named Grant Whitfield, young, sharp-suited, the kind of lawyer who'd clearly practiced looking reasonable in a mirror. Renata carried a cardboard box of documents and wore the same look she probably wore opening a jar nobody else could budge. Judge Marion Aldicott took the bench. She had a reputation around the county for being direct, unshakable, and as Renata mentioned quietly beforehand, she and her husband ran a small hay operation of their own north of town. That didn't guarantee anything, but it meant she understood better than most judges might that water on a working ranch isn't decoration. It's survival. Whitfield went first, trying to frame the entire dispute as theoretical. He argued the line was still technically functioning, that no formal repair request had been filed before construction began, that his client had invested significantly in the property, and that reasonable accommodations could be explored going forward if access ever truly became necessary. Walter kept his eyes down, afraid his face might say something his mouth was trying not to. Then Renata stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform for the room. She simply laid the facts out in the exact order Vance had ignored them, the 1988 recorded easement. The surveyors plat the title records showing clear notice of the corridor, photographs of the wall and its footings, pressure readings, documenting the pump failure receipts for every gallon of hauled water, and a written statement from the neighbor forced to relocate her horses. "Your Honor," Renata said, "an easement doesn't become optional because a stone wall looks nicer without it. My client doesn't have a decorative privilege here. He has a legal property right." The judge turned to Vance directly. "Mr. Vance, were you aware there was a recorded utility easement crossing this section of your property before construction began?" Vance shifted in his seat, and for the first time since Walter had met him, he didn't look entirely certain of himself. "I was aware there was older language in the title, yes. I didn't believe it was enforceable in the way Mr. Briggs is describing." "On what basis?" the judge asked. "I was advised that since I owned the surface and the line was buried, surface improvements could still be considered reasonable," Vance said. The courtroom went quiet enough that Walter could hear the clock ticking against the far wall. Judge Aldicott folded her hands. "Owning the burdened property does not erase a validly recorded easement, Mr. Vance. Underground doesn't mean irrelevant, and a reasonable improvement doesn't include eliminating the easement holder's access entirely." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. "The easement is valid. The wall constitutes unlawful obstruction. You have 21 days to remove the section covering the access corridor and restore full maintenance access to Mr. Briggs. If you fail to comply, the court will authorize Mr. Briggs to arrange removal himself, with costs recoverable from you. Damages, including hauling expenses, boarding losses, repair costs, and attorney's fees, remain open for later determination." Whitfield tried one final maneuver, suggesting they could install a small removable access panel within the wall instead of tearing out the whole section. The judge shut it down without hesitation. "Full access means full access, counsel," she said, "not trap doors in a stone wall." Outside the courthouse, Vance walked past Walter without a word, jaw tight, phone already pressed to his ear. "Now," Renata said, watching him go, "we wait 21 days. But the tone in her voice told Walter she trusted that deadline about as much as he did. The first week passed, nothing happened. The second week passed. Still nothing, no crew, no permit application, no phone call. Walter kept hauling water, kept saving receipts, kept documenting every drop in pressure like it might matter later because Renata had told him it would. On day 18, Renata called. "He's not going to do it voluntarily," she said. "I know," Walter said. On day 21, the wall still stood smooth and self-satisfied under the summer sun. That evening, Walter walked the ranch alone after chores. Past the barn his own hands had built plank by plank. Past the pasture where his sons had once raced each other on ponies that had died of old age decades ago. He realized something out there in the fading light that reshaped how he saw the whole fight. Some people don't become reasonable because reason was never a language they spoke. Men like Vance understood pressure, consequences, a judge's signature at the bottom of an order. So the next morning before sunrise, Walter drove to the corner of his property with Renata beside him, a county utility inspector trailing behind, and a demolition crew rolling in with a court order in hand, and their headlights cutting through the dust. The peaceful part of the story was over. The first saw cut into the limestone sounded sharper than Walter expected, not loud exactly, but the kind of sound that sends every bird in the field lifting off at once. He stood there with a cup of gas station coffee going cold in his hand, watching dust rise off the stone like the land itself was finally exhaling. Nobody on the crew was smiling. That mattered to him. This wasn't revenge. It was simply what happens when a person is given 21 days and decides the calendar doesn't apply to him. About 40 minutes in, just as the first section of wall came free, a black truck came flying down Vance's new driveway, gravel spitting behind the tires. Vance jumped out before the engine had fully stopped, hair still damp, face already red. "What is this?" he shouted. The saw kept running. The crew chief didn't even look up, one of the more satisfying displays of professional indifference Walter had ever witnessed. Vance stormed toward him, pointing at the broken stone like Walter had personally taken a bite out of his future. "You're destroying my property." Walter handed him a folded copy of the court order, because Renata had made him practice exactly this. "You had 21 days, Preston." Vance slapped the paper against his palm without reading it. "This isn't legal." Renata stepped forward, steady as a church bell. "It is, Mr. Vance, that's what a judge's signature means." Vance looked past them at the inspector, the crew, the growing trench cutting across his ruined entrance, and Walter watched the exact moment his confidence went looking for somewhere to hide. Then, because pride is a stubborn animal, Vance did what proud men do when the facts finally corner them. He blamed his contractor for not flagging the pipe properly. He blamed his attorney for bad advice. He blamed the county for outdated records. He even blamed the family who'd sold him the land for not warning him harder, as if a recorded public document was somehow supposed to arrive with its own marching band. Finally, he turned back to Walter. "You could have worked with me." "I tried, Preston," Walter said quietly, "before you ever poured a single footing." Vance looked away. "You made this personal." "No," Walter said, "you did, I just kept the paperwork." By the second day, the story had shifted from obstruction to outright damage. Once the crew fully exposed the service line, the utility inspector knelt down, brushed the dirt away, and waved Walter over. 3 stress fractures ran along the pipe, one bad enough that even Walter, no engineer, could see it wasn't ordinary wear. The weight of the wall, the compacted footings, months of settling stone had crushed the line from above until it finally gave. They ended up replacing 65 feet of pipe entirely, because the inspector wouldn't sign off on patching a section that had been under that kind of pressure for months. Walter stood at the edge of the trench and felt something he hadn't expected, not triumph, just quiet relief. For weeks Vance had treated him like an old man clinging to outdated paperwork over nothing. And there it was, cracked open in the dirt, proof. The ranch slowly came back to life. Pressure returned to the troughs. Dale poured the last tank of hauled water and said he hoped never to see that rattling trailer again. The neighbor brought her horses back a few weeks later, apologizing like she'd done something wrong, though the only thing she'd done was trust a system that had briefly failed her through no fault of her own. For about 3 weeks, Walter allowed himself to believe Vance had finally learned enough to leave well enough alone. He hadn't. Vance sued him, claiming the demolition crew had caused excessive damage to his landscape investment and diminished the resale value of his entrance feature. When Renata read the complaint, she laughed hard enough to have to take her glasses off. "Well, Walter," she said, "some folks step on a rake once and learn, others build an entire personality around it." The second hearing was shorter, colder, and more than a little embarrassing to sit through. Judge Aldicott remembered them both. When Vance's new attorney tried to argue the removal had gone beyond what the order required, Renata simply laid out the inspector's report, the damage photographs, the repair invoices, the original order, and the missed 21-day deadline, one document after another, calm as stacking firewood. The judge dismissed Vance's claim outright and moved straight to damages. Emergency hauling costs, pipe replacement, wall removal expenses, boarding income lost by the neighbor, inspection fees, attorney's costs, and a penalty for willful noncompliance with the original order. The total came to just over $78,000. Vance went pale when the number landed. Walter didn't smile. He just sat there thinking about how easily avoidable the entire ordeal had been, how one honest conversation back in April, one moment of humility, could have saved everyone the cost. But men like Vance don't lose money all at once. They lose it one refused truth at a time, because he still had one more truth left to refuse. Vance appealed. 6 months later, the appellate court upheld the ruling in full and added another $11,000 in costs and fees, bringing the final total past $89,000, spent, in the end, over a driveway entrance meant to make the property look more valuable than it ever became. Within the year, construction signs came down and a real estate listing went up in their place. Preston Vance left the county about as loudly as he'd arrived in it. Folks around town sometimes asked Walter if it felt good, watching a man like that pack up and go. He always gave them the same honest answer: it didn't feel like victory, it felt like peace. The particular kind of peace that settles in when the water runs clear again, when the cattle lower their heads to drink without hesitation, when the wind moves through the pasture and nobody's standing at the fence telling you your rights are inconvenient. Walter never wanted a war with his neighbor, he just wanted his water line left alone. But if 50 years on that land taught him anything, it's that quiet people aren't always weak and patient people aren't always afraid. Sometimes they're simply giving the other person every chance to do right, before they let the consequences finish the conversation for them.